Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, Associate Professor of Literacy, Culture, and International Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the author of the new book, The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games, published by NYU Press as part of their Post-Millennial Pop series, edited by Karen Tongson and Henry Jenkins. We are, in fact, label mates. So it's great to have you on this show today, Professor Thomas. Talk a little bit about this wonderful book of yours, The Dark Fantastic. You begin the book by telling stories about being a young Black girl who was a reader, and being reminded, by the adults in your life that magic isn't real. Talk a little bit about your reading history, as this Black girl growing up in Detroit.
First of all, Professor Neal, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be on Left of Black. One of the reasons I queried Karen and Henry in the first place was because I saw that not only were we label mates, you had more than one book on post-millennial pop. And so this is just a dream come true. My impetus for writing The Dark Fantastic was sort of the way that growing up Black pulled away from traditional forms of magical storytelling in the United States, and I guess in similar cultures, that are Western dominant. So although we are Black and many of us grew up steeped in our culture, especially in music and family and community, church. I was a Baptist church girl. Then you turn on the TV and you would read your children's books, and none of the characters looked like you, right. And right. None of the characters were in any situation, anything close to right. Your childhood situation. So that began a dissonance in me. So on the one hand, I was culturally Black, but then imaginatively, the way that I imagined, adventure, magic, transcendence, and happily ever afters was very white because of the media that I had available to me in 1980s Detroit.
Yeah, talk a little bit about those tensions, particularly from the situation of being a Black kid and Black parents. I went through some of this stuff with my own parents. My mother wouldn't let me read comic books when I was a kid, because there was always this pressure that if you were going to be successful, right, this kind of Black aspirational piece, you had to be centered in the real world and not a creative and fantasy world. So talk about, as a reader, reading against that grain and trying to find your own books and own sources of the fantasy world in terms of film and music, to find that kind of middle ground, if you will.
Well, I read what I had to read in school, and because of aspirational working class Detroit parents, grandparents, great aunts, great uncles, you need to read about our history. So right. One of the things about being a late generation Xer and Xennial is that the civil rights movement and the struggle to get us there was still very much in living memory. Not only that, it was yesterday from my little girlhood. So there was this sense that you had an obligation to learn about enslavement and learn about civil rights and learn about the struggle and learn about the triumph, so that whenever you were reading children's books, they were meant to teach you something, with notable exceptions. Virginia Hamilton's books were very different, and I loved her. She was my favorite. Walter D. Myers, occasionally we had The Legend of Tariq from him. But I confess that I didn't appreciate the books of Julius Lester or Mildred Taylor as I should have. I devoured them, but it felt like my grandparents telling stories about their struggles or their parents' struggles in Alabama or Florida or Mississippi. And I wanted adventure. I wanted to play. I didn't want to think about the KKK when I was 8 years old. And and so when young people say today, I am not my ancestors, it seems obnoxious But what they're getting at is not a disrespect toward loved ones, but sort of this fatigue over having to carry this burden that's handed down to you in our communities, necessarily from childhood. And so balancing what other kids get, which is, you get to read a children's book sometimes and see yourself slaying a dragon or stepping into a magical realm. And if you're a Black child and you're in schools, especially if you're in mainstream schools or schools outside of our communities, where you show up on the bookshelf as a child is enslaved, or you have to march. Basically, you're having to prove your humanity in those narratives.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're writing primarily about children's books, young adult literature. And one of the things you point out, just looking at the industry as a whole, right, there's on the one hand, the lack of diversity, which has, been a narrative that's been really important the last 5 or 10 years, but also what you call the imagination gap. Talk a little bit about that. And you reference that a little bit in terms of the way that diversity shows up, within these kind of stereotypical forms. But could you expand a little bit more about this idea of the imagination gap in children's literature?
So I'm still at the very beginning of my formulation of that concept, even though I wrote The Dark Fantastic and I talk about race in the imagination, but of course, as scholars, lifelong learning. So I'm thinking about the ways that children's literature, reading curriculum, stories from family, community, and religious organizations form this prosody that is the clay that shapes childhood imagination across cultures. So if you're reading from your very earliest memories through age 18, is, seen to be in a container of sorts. What's in that container? Another kind of work I've been doing and haven't yet written the book about is I look at enslavement and how it gets introduced through children's books and not really history class, especially post No Child Left Behind. And I really value Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project, because when I first started thinking about that, about 8 or 9 years ago, people were questioning, why are you focusing on slavery? That's so depressing. And, but the problem is, I think as a culture, we need to think about the container that our kids have, where you pour in, all these different sources of information, sources of storytelling. And by the time they're young adults, they have reached certain conclusions about the world, about the self, and even how they can imagine. So the boundaries of imagination are set. And I, of course, draw upon Toni Morrison and her very valuable work in Playing in the Dark there. And so if Black people are only in certain positions in children's books, and most of the children's books you've read, or most of the reading textbooks you've ever gotten, and then you reach age 18, then we're set in your imagination in particular ways. And I think that that's an underexamined area.
Your great critical intervention here, of course, is the concept of the dark fantastic. And you're careful to make distinctions between that and, say, the Black fantastic or Afrofuturism. So expound a little bit about, what exactly the dark fantastic is.
Yes, thanks. And thanks so much for appreciating that, because I think people in children's literature really wanted me to write a book about Afrofuturism in children's literature. And there are a few reasons why I didn't do that. First, children's literature criticism as a field is almost completely dominated by Western, white, and especially UK influenced storytelling. So English language modern children's literature absolutely was birthed in the UK during the height of empire. So, that's nothing new to those outside of children's literature. But what's happened is the interventionists in children's literature have very much been marginalized and sort of, very politely and nicely, because children's lit is a nice field, pushed out the feet. So there are Black women, and, I know of a couple of Black men who are elders or senior scholars over me, but the critical interventions in the field were such that a lot of that work has been buried and hidden beyond Rudine Sims Bishop, Dr. Bishop's landmark study, Shadow and Substance, came out in 1982, where she actually made the case for this African-American children's storytelling tradition and opened up criticism of multicultural children's books. So we use her term mirrors, windows, and doors. I've seen that travel beyond children's literature. But the challenge was that I was intervening in a field that wasn't even ready to consider the very few books by authors of color that were not meant to teach something, because children's literature has this didactic function. We're supposed to always be, we say it's supposed to be stories of wonder and whimsy, but children's literature is didactic. It teaches the young. And so, so often the books that we have were historical or sort of contemporary realism, but very limited. I joke about the 5 Black kids you meet in children's literature when I go on. Yeah, you probably already know who they are. You're not only enslaved, but you're running for freedom, and you're only one of 10 people.
Right.
Who are living through Jim Crow. And that is not, some of my favorite books are the Logan family cycle, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And I mean, the Grand Dame, Mildred Taylor, we just got All the Days Past, All the Days Come, but still we get that narrative. We get civil rights narratives, but often they're not written by Black authors. Some are, but then some aren't. You get the contemporary ghetto narrative that never shows anyone what growing up in Detroit or Chicago or New Orleans or et cetera. It just shows, the boy is, being, trying to choose between joining a gang or something like that. And a girl, you can't get pregnant. So it's always meant to, it's like a horrible, twisted after school special where everybody like trying to, tempt you. And then the 5th is the Black best friend who really has no agency. Those are the 5 characters you meet in children's books. And, and
sometimes they're all one and the same.
right, exactly. So I was intervening there. I told them, I said, we can't even have the Afrofuturism or Black Fantastic book yet. There are some new scholars who are doing that work. We needed the critical intervention to show how Black characters are getting trapped in this dark fantastic cycle throughout this tradition of storytelling first.
Yeah, one of the things, this is a book that, it is, when all is said and done, is a book about Black girl magic, right? And it makes sense because you were once a Black girl with magic and now you're a Black woman with magic. But beyond that obvious set of circumstances, right? Why was it important for you to frame this really about storytelling that dealt with Black girls?
Because I've been arguing with my mama since I came here in 77. So, we were arguing this morning about, the recent announcement we had about the White House. And so I began my words with my mama's words. There is no magic, because I was the kind of Black child who was sitting up in 1980s Detroit, early 1990s Detroit, right before and during the crack era. My head would be in the clouds. I've always wanted to think about the past, the magical past, or the Afro future. I was that little kid who was running around talking about I was going to be a starship captain because I love Star Trek, as so many of us did. I was the kid who wanted to make an all-Black Avonlea, and Anne of Green Gables and this sort of idyllic, world with flowers. And my mother was like, you are a Black child. You need to face reality in order to survive. And I know that was a concern for my family. Even my stepfather, who passed 9 years ago, one of the last things he said to me was, Eb, your head is, because I'm in my early 30s, he said, honey, your head is in the clouds. And so I think I am still sort of fighting this community narrative. As much as I love and treasure and value my Blackness and my community, I also feel as if, thinking that magic and wonder and whimsy is antithetical to being authentically Black is a whole problem. So that's why I took my stance.
Talk a little bit about the text that you really chose to dive into: the Hunger Games, Harry Potter, and the Vampire Diaries. So why those particular texts? What was it about those narratives that you felt that you had to make the kind of intervention that you made?
So when I was in my early 20s, after my dad who raised me passed, I joined Harry Potter fandom as a young teacher because I was really into the books. And it was the first time I had ever seen a white author include a secondary character who was Black and actually seemed to have something going on beyond just being wallpaper, the best friend, or having a sassy remark or something like that. So I loved Angelina Johnson in the book series, who played Quidditch. She was one of the best players on the team. She had a boyfriend, and back in the 1980s after school special day, Lisa Turtle from Saved by the Bell, Lark Voorhees was the prettiest girl on there, and she was never really, nothing much was going on with her. So anyway, I love the books, got into the fandom, and I noticed that we were at the beginning of a moment where the culture was turning from realism to sort of the fantastic in the early 2000s. So the kids I was teaching, they loved Harry Potter. And then after they finished with Harry Potter and began growing up, they were drawn to Marvel and DC, so the comic book superhero legendaria. They were drawn to vampire stories. So they made Twilight a sensation. They made The Hunger Games and dystopia a huge phenomenon. So children's literature went from being a very niche industry, mainly patronized by parents, caregivers, teachers, and librarians, to being something that ate the culture, right? So we look at Wesley Snipes back in the 90s with Blade, and then we see what the Marvel Cinematic Universe did. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to choose representative text that signaled these stories that most children in the United States and in many other countries were reading. So that became the Harry Potter series, the Hunger Games. I didn't choose to focus on Twilight. I chose the Vampire Diaries instead because there was a prominent Black girl character. Twilight did not include us. And then finally, I actually chose the BBC's Merlin because I got very tired of people saying, oh, that's just, you Black Americans are only analyzing the United States. It's very different here in the UK. And so I chose a British show and text to analyze.
One of the things you talk about early in the book is, and I love this phrase, critical race counter storytelling for the digital age. And I have a follow-up question with that also, but, explain that out for folks.
So because I wanted to sort of counter story these narratives, these fairy tales, fantasies, I wanted to look at these characters and these stories from a Black perspective, because sometimes when we're analyzing for race, the field always thinks we're analyzing Black texts, and I do that work, right?
Right.
But Black people are also located in this culture too, and so we also watch the Hunger Games, and we also read Harry Potter. As a matter of fact, David and Dan from Game of Thrones owe Black folks on Twitter some money because Black Twitter Game of Thrones, which did not include us except for on the margin, and made it phenomenal. So I said, well, what would a Black reading, especially a Black girl reading of these stories look like? And so we just, we learned that from Professor Bell and Delgado and Matsuda and all the founders of critical race theory, that no, we're going to use narrative to analyze this society in which we're property from our own perspectives. So that was why I chose that method.
So you've been in the classroom with children. You're teaching teachers, to some extent at this point in time. Are you a practitioner, right? Do you have like a pseudonym someplace where you're writing dark fantasy right now?
I'll never tell. So I have a YA novel that's has an agent. We haven't submitted it yet because I've been rewriting and revising with Janklow and Nesbitt's Brooke Sherman. He's the agent for Angie Thomas, who wrote The Hate You Give. So I'm working it out and have been trying to tell these stories. But, shout out to all the amazing Black men and women who are doing the work right now. Kwame and Balia's Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky was the first fantasy novel that I can remember to be honored by the Coretta Scott King Awards. And so shout out to him, to Danielle Clayton, Justina Ireland. I want to call these names, L.L. McKinney. There's a lot that have been published over the past year specifically who have written. And I also want to call out an author scholar who has left the academy to start her own self-publishing outfit, Dr. Zetta Elliott, who is one of the earlier harbingers of this work. I quote her extensively. She's Black Canadian and published a first picture book that was more realistic in tone. And then she tried and could not place fantasy novels at all over 10 years ago. So, there's a full list of folks who are finally starting to break through, but I'm worried that, you know how publishing and Hollywood and media does, I'm afraid that they'll get a certain number and then decide, okay, that's enough.
That's enough, right? Yeah, absolutely. I was also struck, changing direction just a little bit. You talk early in the book about what it meant for you at the time as a junior scholar in a field that privileges academic journal articles and not the monograph. What kind of real challenge was it for you institutionally in other ways to make that choice that, no, I'm going to do this thing now? Because it's important to my career, but it's also important, to what's happening in the field. Talk a little bit about that decision making on your part.
I just have to give a shout out to the University of Pennsylvania. We all, I was speaking earlier, but, Penn has been an enthusiastic supporter of my work. And I want to call some names here too. Vivian Gadsden, who is an eminent scholar of education. She's a psychologist and looks at literacy across the life course. She's very well known in educational research. She is my mentor. She was my assigned mentor, and she enthusiastically supported my writing a book before tenure. And so did my former dean, Andrew Porter, who is a statistician, which was, he was, not only was he supportive, he almost forced me to apply for my first postdoc. That's a funny story. I didn't think I should apply for this postdoc because of the kind of work that we do in literacy and reading education. We tend not to be, those who go for, national postdocs. We go into classrooms and we sit with children and we read books, but they really saw the vision for this line of work. And now post tenure, my current dean, Pam Grossman, and my current chair, Gerald Campano, are super supportive of me continuing to write books and do criticism and focus on that, and with a little bit of empirical research. So I think it's because I was at Penn.
It's always good to hear stories of people who win, and you have absolutely won with this book. We've been talking with Professor Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, Associate Professor of Literacy, Culture, and International Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination, from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games, published by New York University Press. It has been such a pleasure to talk with you, Professor Thomas.
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Neal.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.